The sound that ripped through the peaceful afternoon was a violent, guttural roar, a mechanical shriek of grinding gears and diesel-fueled fury that was utterly alien to the quiet sanctuary I had just begun to call home. I had been inside my family's cabin for less than 3 hours. The last of the moving boxes just thudded onto the dusty heart pine floor. I was standing on the wide, covered porch, a cold bottle of water in my hand, looking out at the single most beautiful feature of my new life, the old, weathered wooden dock that stretched out over the pristine, glass-like surface of Golden Lake. It was the dock my great-grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. A place of silent sunrises and quiet contemplation, the very heart of this property's legacy. The roar grew louder, closer. I saw it then, crashing through the delicate stand of birch trees that marked the edge of my property. Coming from the direction of the new, hyper-manicured Golden Lake Estates development, it was a bulldozer, a massive, bright yellow Caterpillar. D9, its heavy steel treads chewing up the soft earth, its massive blade held high like the maw of some prehistoric beast, and it was heading directly for my dock. I stood there, paralyzed for a single, heart-stopping second by the sheer, unmitigated insanity of what I was witnessing. I dropped my water bottle and sprinted from the porch, my boots slipping on the pine needles, my voice a raw, desperate shout that was swallowed by the engine's roar. "Hey, stop! What are you doing? This is private property." The man in the cab, a grim-faced operator in a hard hat, glanced at me without expression and continued his inexorable advance, standing on the manicured lawn of the neighboring mansion. Directing the machine with a series of sharp, imperious hand gestures was a woman in a crisp white pantsuit. It was Mrs. Harrington, the president of the Golden Lake Estates Homeowners Association. A look of triumphant, righteous glee was etched on her face. I was still 50 yards away when the bulldozer reached the shoreline. There was no hesitation. The massive steel blade lowered with a hydraulic hiss, bit into the earth, and slammed into the side of my dock. The sound of 70-year-old seasoned timber splintering was like the cracking of ancient bones. In a single brutal pass, the dozer tore the first third of the structure from its pilings, churning the wood and the lake bed into a muddy, chaotic slurry. It backed up, its engine screaming, and rammed it again. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, violent, and calculated act of destruction. My name is Alex Monroe, and I am a water resource engineer. I have spent the last 20 years of my life working on massive, complex dam and reservoir projects in some of the most remote corners of the world. I understand, on a deep, fundamental level, the intricate, often invisible systems that keep communities alive. I understand the delicate balance of water rights, infrastructure, and the law. And I had just moved home to this cabin to retire, to escape the high-stakes world of concrete and contracts, and find a piece of quiet for myself. This cabin, and the 50 acres of land it sat on, was my family's legacy. It was a holdout, property, a legally separate and sovereign parcel that my great-grandfather, civil engineer himself, had purchased in the 1930s. He had not just bought the land. He had built the dam that had created the 300-acre Golden Lake in the first place, and in doing so, had secured the sole, unassailable legal rights to the lake bed, the dam itself, and all the water it contained. When my father sold the surrounding 2,000 acres to the developers of the Golden Lake Estates in the early 2000s, he had honored his father's legacy. He had sold them the land for their 300 luxury homes, but he had not sold them the water. The deal, a masterpiece of legal foresight, had granted the new development a formal, registered water use easement. They had the right to draw a specific, metered amount of water from the lake for their household use and to irrigate their golf course. In exchange, they paid a substantial annual fee to my family's trust. But the contract was explicit. The ownership of the lake, the dam, and all associated infrastructure remained with the owner of the original cabin plot. That owner was now me, the new HOA, led by the ambitious and tyrannical Mrs. Harrington, had never been content with this arrangement. She saw the lake as theirs, and me as a stubborn, inconvenient gatekeeper. Her campaign to bring me to heel had begun the moment I started the process of moving in. It started with the letters, delivered by her lawyers, filled with intimidating jargon. They claimed my family's old rustic dock was a derelict and unsafe structure, an architectural blight that violated their new aesthetic marina guidelines. They demanded I tear it down and replace it, at my own expense, with a new HOA-approved composite dock from a vendor that I was sure was a close personal friend of hers. I had responded with a polite but firm letter from my own attorney, reminding her that my property was not part of her association, that my dock predated her entire community by half a century, and that her bylaws had no jurisdiction over my land. I had even included a copy of a recent structural survey I had commissioned, proving my dock was perfectly safe and sound. Her response had been a final, chillingly arrogant notice of violation. It stated that if the non-compliant structure was not removed within 30 days, the HOA would exercise its right to remove the nuisance and bill me for the cost. I had, of course, dismissed it as the impotent, legally baseless threat that it was. I had never, in my wildest imagination, thought that she would be insane enough to actually act on it, to hire a bulldozer and physically invade my land. Standing on the muddy, desecrated shore of my own lake, watching this machine tear apart my family's history, I was filled with a rage so cold and so profound it felt like a physical force. Mrs. Harrington strode toward me, her expensive white shoes somehow avoiding the worst of the mud, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. There she said, her voice ringing with the finality of a queen passing sentence. "The derelict structure has been removed. You'll receive the bill for the demolition service in the mail. Now your property is one step closer to meeting community standards." I just stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of legal statutes and engineering schematics. I looked at the churning, muddy water where my dock once stood, where the bulldozer's heavy treads had gouged deep into the lake bed. I looked at the spot where I knew, with an engineer's absolute certainty, the main 4-inch water intake pipe and the primary control valve for the entire Golden Lake Estates community was located, buried just a few feet beneath the surface. An intake pipe that was, as per the easement agreement, my private property. A pipe that had almost certainly just been shattered into 1,000 pieces by the immense, brutal force of her machine. She saw my silence as a sign of defeat. She smirked, turned, and began to walk back toward the pristine, manicured lawn of her own lakefront mansion, her work here done. The bulldozer rumbled away, its work of destruction complete, leaving a wake of muddy water and splintered wood. Behind it, I didn't yell. I didn't threaten her with a lawsuit, though one was certainly coming. I simply pulled out my phone and glanced at the time, 2:15 p.m. I looked out at the massive, castle-like water tower that stood on a hill behind the development, the one that provided the water pressure for all 300 of their multi-million-dollar homes. I knew with the cold, hard certainty of a man who had designed such systems that a tower of that size held, at most, a 90-minute supply of water. I stood there on my ruined shoreline, a strange, calm, almost pitying look on my face, and began to silently count down the minutes. The begging, I suspected, would begin at approximately 3:45 p.m. For the next hour, I did nothing. I simply sat on the porch of my cabin, the silence of the lake now replaced by the quiet, methodical ticking of a clock in my head. I made a pot of strong black coffee. I watched a family of deer emerge from the woods and drink from the far side of the lake, unconcerned with the human drama that had just unfolded. The world continued to turn, but I knew that the world of the Golden Lake Estates was about to grind to a sudden, screeching halt. The first sign of the coming apocalypse came at 3:38 p.m. It was the sound of the massive automated irrigation system on the community's golf course, a system that drew thousands of gallons of water a minute, sputtering, coughing, and then falling silent. A profound, unnatural quiet descended over the valley. Then my phone, which I had placed on the porch railing, began to explode. It was the community's online message board, a forum I had joined to keep an eye on my new neighbors. The posts began as a trickle of confusion, then grew into a flood of outright panic. Anyone else's water pressure just dropped to zero? Can't get anything out of the kitchen faucet. My shower just died mid-shampoo. What is going on? The golf course sprinklers are off. The greens are going to burn. Does anyone know who to call? Is a man in a mansion a quarter-mile away? In the middle of washing his prized Porsche, turned on his hose, and only a sad dribble emerged. The community's massive, cascading waterfall feature at the front gate slowed to a pathetic trickle, and then stopped, its pump groaning in protest. The water pressure in every single one of the 300 luxury homes in the development had vanished. As their water tower, their only buffer against reality, had finally run dry. I watched as Mrs. Harrington's own phone began to ring. A frantic, insistent sound I could hear even from my porch. I saw her on her back patio, her earlier smugness now replaced by a look of confused alarm. She barked orders into her phone, first at the community manager, then at the county water department. I could imagine the conversation with the county. They would have politely informed her that they were not the provider for her private development. The provider. They would have told her after looking up the records. It's a private entity called the Golden Lake Water Control Board, a name she had likely never heard of, but which was, in fact, the legal name of my family's trust that managed the water rights and the easement agreement. It took her another 10 agonizing minutes to put the pieces together. The full, catastrophic weight of her actions finally crashed down upon her. The main valve, the single critical piece of infrastructure that supplied her entire world with the lifeblood of water, was located on the property of the man whose dock she had just triumphantly and illegally demolished. At 4:02 p.m., she came running back to my property line. Her face no longer a mask of arrogant control, but a crumpled canvas of pure white-hot panic. She was not alone. A small, terrified delegation of her most influential neighbors were with her. They were not threatening, they were begging. "Please," she cried, her voice a desperate, ragged plea. "Turn the water back on. We have no water. What did you do?" I stood up from my rocking chair and walked slowly to the edge of my lawn, a few feet from where she stood. I held up my hands in a gesture of calm innocence. "Didn't do anything." "Mrs. Harrington, you did? That's impossible," she shrieked. "You've sabotaged us," I said, and my voice was the calm, patient, and slightly condescending tone of an engineer explaining a complex system to a willfully ignorant client. "You sabotaged yourselves. That bulldozer you used to illegally destroy my private dock also happened to crush the main 4-inch ductile iron water intake pipe and the primary control valve for your entire community's water supply. That infrastructure," I said, holding up a copy of the original easement agreement I had retrieved from my cabin, "is, as you can see in Section 7, my private property. The agreement you all signed gives you the right to the water, but it explicitly states that you are not to tamper with, alter, or in any way interfere with the physical infrastructure. You have just committed a multi-million-dollar breach of your own water agreement and, in the process, have cut yourselves off from your only legal water source." The faces of her neighbors turned from panic to a new, directed fury, a fury aimed directly at her. The sheriff was called again, this time by a dozen panicked residents reporting a community-wide water outage. When Deputy Brody arrived, he was faced not with a simple property dispute, but a potential public health crisis. I calmly presented all my documents once more, the deed to the land and the lake bed, the water rights agreement, the county permits. For my now-destroyed dock, the deputy, after a long, grim conversation with the county administrator and the emergency services coordinator on his radio, confirmed that I was in a position of absolute legal and logistical power. He informed a horrified Mrs. Harrington that she and her unlicensed contractor were liable for the destruction of private property and the destruction of critical infrastructure, crime that carried massive state and federal penalties. I now had the entire community, all 300 multi-million-dollar homes, completely at my mercy. Their world had run dry, and I was the only man with the water. That evening, formal emergency meeting was held in the HOA's clubhouse, illuminated by candlelight. I was not invited, but I was the only subject of discussion. At 9 p.m., a new humbled delegation, this time led by a terrified-looking HOA vice president, arrived at my door. Mrs. Harrington was conspicuously absent. They didn't negotiate. They listened. I laid out my terms for restoring their water. It was not a request. First, the Golden Lake Estates HOA would pay up front and in full for the complete reconstruction of my family's dock, not with cheap materials, but with the finest historically accurate cypress wood by a master craftsman of my choosing. Second, the HOA would pay a massive 7-figure emergency repair and breach of contract fine directly to my family's trust. This was non-negotiable. Third, the annual water lease fee, as per the penalty clause in the original agreement, would be tripled, effective immediately and for the remainder of the contract's term. And fourth, Mrs. Harrington would personally and publicly resign as HOA president and from the board, effective immediately. Issue a written apology to me and my family. They agreed to every single term without a moment's hesitation. They were thirsty for a deal. A month later, a beautiful, but historically identical dock stood in the place of the old one, its cypress wood glowing in the sun. The water was flowing once more to the Golden Lake Estates, but at a much, much higher price. A new, far more respectful HOA president had sent me a letter of profound, almost groveling apology. I sat on my new dock. Fishing in the quiet afternoon, the check for the fine safely deposited, its funds already earmarked for a university engineering scholarship in my great-grandfather's name. I had not sought a war, but they had brought their bulldozer to my door. They just hadn't realized that my dock was connected to their faucet. I had not just won. I had used their own reckless aggression to secure the future of my family's legacy and to teach an entire community a permanent and very expensive lesson about the hidden vital systems that hold their fragile world together, and the quiet, unassuming engineer who controlled them all.